Hello and welcome everyone to this EPC policy dialogue titled Israel-Iran War and the Future of the Middle East. My name is Mihai. Chihaia. I'm a policy analyst with the European Policy Center, and I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion. The event today is part of an online series of events the EPC has been running over the past months, looking to unpack developments in the Middle East region. We've seen after more or less 12 days of Israeli strikes, Iranian missile and drone attacks, plus US strikes on Iran's nuclear installations, followed by an Iranian strike on Al Udeid air base. President Trump has announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. This begs, of course, the question, what happens next? What is the damage to Iran's nuclear program? What is the future of negotiations for a nuclear deal with Iran? And also, what are the lessons learned from the confrontation over the past 12 days? So our aim today for this discussion is to unpack what happened, what has been the strategic thinking of different parties, including, of course, the strategic thinking in Washington, D.C., but also at EU and IFRI level, and what might come next. For this, we have an excellent panel of experts today, and I'm just going to introduce them one by one. We have with us Nimrod Goren, who's co-founder and executive board member at Diplomeds and president of the Mitvim Institute. Welcome, Nimrod. We also have with us Adnan Tabatabai, who's co-founder and CEO of CARPO. Thirdly, we have Burcu Ozcelik, who's a senior research fellow for Middle East security at RUSI in London. And last but not least, we have Héloïse Fayet, who's a research fellow and head of Deterrence and Proliferation program at IFRI in Paris. A very warm welcome to you all. Maybe before we start, a couple of thoughts on the run of show. We'll start with a couple of questions for our speakers, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers with the audience. I encourage you to ask your questions early. We only have 1 hour and a lot of issues to unpack. To ask a question, you have at the bottom of your screen the Q&A box, so please type your question there. I will read it out loud and we see who's best to address it. And without further ado, I'm looking at you, Nimrod. Maybe you can take us a little bit through how it all started, what has been the Israeli strategic thinking behind starting the strikes, and where we are now with the ceasefire. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Hi, it's a pleasure being here also with all the guest speakers. Yes, I will try to begin with some context from an Israeli perspective, and then later on we can maybe discuss lessons learned on Israel-US, Israel-Arab relations, Gaza prediction, etc. The lead-up to this Israeli-Iran confrontation basically is part of the post-October 7 mindset and reality that Israel is in. It's a prolonged, never-ending kind of war in Gaza that is coupled with a multi-front warfare that Israel is confronting for the first time in its history, leading to a new strategic mindset that basically seeks to take proactive military steps at the territory of the enemies whenever there is an indication of both a wish by another actor to destroy, damage Israel, plus the assessment that there is capacity to do so. And I think we saw that playing out in Lebanon and in Syria in different ways, first vis-a-vis Hezbollah, and then when the transition happened in Syria, the taking out of the Syrian military capacities by Israel, gradually creating a situation where Israel physically had the ability to fly all the way towards Iran without facing major pushback or military threats against its airplanes. Plus the sense that with Trump in the White House, despite all the tensions and differences of views between Trump and Netanyahu, there is American backing for actions against the Iranian nuclear project, especially when the negotiations for a deal did not go that well. An assessment that other regional countries, even if they do not publicly welcome an Israeli action, will actually be quite content from it. And within the international community, including Europe, this will be seen as a more legitimate type of war compared to what Israel is doing in Gaza. For Netanyahu, there was kind of a personal motivation of revamping his public positioning after all that happens, in October 7th and later on, plus his historic mission of the savior of the Israeli people, the Jewish people, against the Iranian threat. You remember all his speeches at the UN, etc. So all of that, coupled with the real security concern about the Iranian nuclear project and missile capacities, basically led Israel to do this action that over 12 days was intended to limit the capacity or create significant damage to both the nuclear project and the military missile capacity, not to totally eliminate it, according to the official statements, with some kind of underlying hope that all of that action will somehow spark a change domestically from the opposition in Iran. So that wasn't the intended goal, but Israelis would have been happy if after the attacks there would be some sort of a protest emerging in the streets in Tehran. And when all of that kind of ends, there is now a debate within Israel whether that was a success or not. So generally, it is presented by the prime minister as a huge success, major achievement. All the goals have been reached. The fact that Israel mobilized the Americans to take military action for the sake of also an Israeli interest, the superiority and the freedom of action that Israel projected in the skies of Iran. All of this is played also for political reasons as an achievement. While on the other hand, there is also the question marks about, is it a strategic game changer? Are we now in a totally different situation or merely a continuation of it with a bit of a different conditions and the unprecedented damage that the Israeli home front suffered from it all? The photo you saw from Tel Aviv, Haifa, Beersheba is something we never saw before. Lots of damage caused to the home front. And wrapping it up, looking at the ceasefire, yes, it was a Trump dictate, but I think the indications were before that both Israel and Iran were conveying, even publicly, messages that they are willing to quiet it down. The way Trump did it is kind of the new pathway of diplomacy, apparently. There is no agreement. There was no negotiation. There is nothing that the sides can now abide to and say whether one or the other is breaking the ceasefire. There is actually a tweet rather than an agreement. But there is interest of seeing that hold, and I think that will carry on for a while, even if it's clear that it doesn't solve the key issue at stake, and much will depend whether it ignites renegotiation between the US and Iran on the nuclear deal and beyond. So that's kind of a bit of where we are from an Israeli perspective, where things are definitely still in play and are not totally clear.
Thank you, Nimrod, for providing us the context of where you are. I'm left, maybe, of course, there are many good points that you made, but I'm left with an interesting one. That is it, this sort of two side, was it, of course, a success, a major achievement versus whether it is a strategic game changer? And I'm sure we're gonna touch upon that later in the conversation. I have many questions myself, but maybe I'll move now to Adnan and then we'll come back to you once we also see what questions the audience has. So I'm looking at you, Adnan, and obviously I'm wondering about, of course, how Iran has responded and what are the next steps for Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mihai. Thanks to EPC for putting together this online panel with wonderful colleagues. Let me start basically going not from the beginning, but from the end, from where we are today. So what we currently have is a fragile ceasefire, and it's going to be it's going to remain fragile for some time. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to reduce the hostilities down to zero after quite an intense exchange of fire for 12 days. So what we currently need, and this is what immediately goes towards European audience, also European policymakers, we need now an environment in which three parties, the US, Israel, and Iran, need victory speeches. And all three sides have to be granted those victory speeches. Obviously, all three sides have to swallow the victory speech of the other. But what is important is also that external parties, be it European countries, for example, should do their messaging in a way that basically entertains the victory speeches of all sides. What is Iran's victory speech? In a very, very brief and short sentence, one could say, Iran says the enemies imposed a war on us, but we are imposing a ceasefire on them, because we have shown resilience, we have shown unity, we have shown strength. And this brings me gradually back in the past 12, 13 days. Iran has been able to, or let me start with that. Iran has not been able to basically protect its airspace. And honestly, unsurprisingly so, because we're talking here about the most powerful or one of the most powerful air forces in the globe, backed by NATO. It's not just the US. It's not just, let's say, some regional countries that Israel has good relations with. It's basically the entire NATO apparatus in and around the Mediterranean that at the very latest comes to the defense of Israel. So it is unsurprising that Iran militarily, in terms of conventional military power, is much inferior. And never ever did someone in his right mind in Iran claim otherwise. So after, of course, being clearly inferior in terms of protecting Iran's airspace, Iran was able, on the other hand, to strike or to target critical sites on Israeli territory and hit those targets. And I don't know whether it's a matter of age, but I start liking analogies more and more. And one analogy that I used to make early on in October last year is you have to think of Iran as the old George Foreman, the boxer who was able to hit severe blows, but wasn't able to protect his face properly while boxing. Or think of a football team that has the most capable strikers on the pitch, but not a proper defense line. And it can receive a lot, but may also be able to score a lot. Now, these analogies are obviously euphemistically used now, and we shouldn't romanticize this. But what I'm trying to say is that Iran has shown that it can hit Israel severely. And obviously, the assessments and Nimrod related to that already when it comes to what is the damage in Iran. We also don't have a clear picture about the damage inflicted upon Israel. And again, coming back to the victory speech part, maybe we shouldn't poke either side too much about the efficiency of strikes, about the harm that has been inflicted upon them, but rather allow for the moment to basically lean back and show that this should now come to an end. I think what has been important on the Iranian side, and this would be my last bit, and when we come to the beginning of the whole thing, let us not forget that a promising diplomatic process was ongoing when all of this happened. We saw a gap, and that's critical. We saw a gap between political will and technical solutions. We had a solid political will in Iran and in the US to strike some sort of deal that would end the threat of Iran's nuclear program, or the perceived threat of Iran's nuclear program. But what hasn't been working out so far, and that is not very surprising, is to translate that into real technical steps, the sequencing of measures that would ensure that. So that would need more time. Donald Trump is not necessarily the most disciplined person on earth when it comes to being consistent and continuously working on something. He has become impatient, and the opponents of an agreement managed to enter his head and convince him that military operation could catalyze this political process in the way that he wants to. So that's why there was this shock attack on 13th June. Iran managed to somehow regain control of the remnants of its air defenses, was able to carry out strikes. And I think the one point that is really important is that Iran simply isn't a group of a paramilitary entity that has come into being 46 years ago, but it is a state that has existed for centuries with different political leadership. And it shows here that you have institutions that carry on existing even if you kill their leaders or heads, etc. And the population, this is my final point, you can be the fiercest opponent of the political leadership of your country while at the same time not wanting your country to be bombed. And that's where the dichotomy that was presented to us also in the European media, that necessarily the very opposition that exists against the political leadership in Iran will necessarily lead to people pouring into the streets, welcoming strikes, and then staging some sort of, I don't know, toppling the government, etc. I'll leave it at this. I hope I addressed your questions slightly, dear Mihai, and looking forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you, Adnan. Yes, you did address my initial question and much more context. Thank you for that. Thank you also for mentioning the importance of the victory speeches for all parties. I think that's extremely relevant as we move forward. I have one pressing aspect, because you mentioned that at some point there was a promising diplomatic path before the strikes. Can we go back to that promising diplomatic path? Do you see any way to go back to that?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. We can build on that later. I don't want to take more time of Burcu and Héloïse, but I'm quite positive that it will be possible.
Thank you, Anna. Now I'm moving to you, Burcu, for a more regional perspectives, and it would be curious to know what were the regional reactions to the developments that unfolded. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to EPC for organizing this, and it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be on the panel alongside such esteemed experts. I think a good place to start would be to acknowledge the collective sense of relief in the region following the announcement of the ceasefire. I think there was a high level of concern, to say the very least, even amongst Gulf states. And here, I think one of the issues in much of the, or misperception, was the view that because of the long history of friction between Arab Gulf states and Iran, that somehow these states were quietly cheerleading the attacks on Iranian territory. I think that is a misperception. And worth puncturing that, and that Gulf states, particularly, of course, Oman, Muscat was leading the diplomatic efforts ahead of the Israeli military campaign on the nuclear talks. There was a sense of frustration that the diplomacy track was prematurely derailed, and that there were serious concerns about conflict spillover, about potential Iranian retaliation against energy installations and ports. It was my assessment, I think many of us shared this view, that Iran was unlikely to use to carry through its threat to shut the Strait of Hormuz. That would have countered Iran's own interests. It would have severely damaged its phase of normalization with its Gulf neighbors and jeopardize the future of those relationships. So in the background as well to Operation Rising Lion, of course, was frustration, agitation, discontent across the Middle East from the Arab states and from Turkey over the ongoing situation in Gaza as well. So with that as a context, the opening up of the new front on Iran, I think, created serious concern. In terms of the Turkish perspective, which I will touch upon very briefly, of course, Turkey and Iran have a complex historical relationship. Again, here, I think much of the analysis tended to focus on how Ankara was the winner in this battle between Iran and Israel somehow, that Iran becoming militarily weakened and cornered, as well as Israel coming under direct fire, would somehow benefit Turkey. And this is a well-worn type of argument, I think. There, the risk is jumping to conclusions about how Turkey sees its neighbors and its neighborhood. Whilst regional adversaries at times, Turkey and Iran have a series of interdependencies, particularly in energy, in border security. There have been serious strategic and policy disagreements over each of their priorities in Iraq and Syria, certainly, and particularly over the Kurdish movement. But overall, there has been a recognition that both countries have long histories as civilizational powers in the Middle East. Not to trivialize the points of friction, but to point out that there was a consensus across the region that Israeli military operations and the subsequent American operation against Iran's nuclear facilities could tip the region into a new phase of potentially spiraling violence. And this was not something that anyone was cheering on for. On the contrary, there were calls for de-escalation, for diplomacy, the respect for international law, and a severe concern for whether this will be precedent setting. And I think on that point, of course, the bomb damage assessment's ongoing, but beyond that, two significant illusions or myths, longstanding, have been shattered. And one of them was the notion that Iran's nuclear program was untouchable, was invincible. And so that myth has been shattered by both Israeli strikes and the American strikes as well. But on the flip side of that, the idea that American military bases in allied Gulf states were untouchable has also been broken. So this precedent of the potential for kinetic military strikes, for escalation, this has created a new precedent for both, that points to both a danger in the future of a return to violence, but it also potentially provides the ground for why it matters so much that diplomacy now is given a fair chance at succeeding. Those are some of the state views, I think, from across the region. What's also worth mentioning, and we might talk about this, is how Shia communities, particularly in Iraq and across the region, groups aligned with Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, various Iraqi paramilitary groups that also yield significant political influence inside Iraq, how they will respond to and interpret, as Adnan was saying, the various victory narratives that are emerging. So how these groups internalize the victory narrative that Tehran is promoting in terms of its resilience, its ability not to necessarily deter, but to certainly resist Israeli military strikes. And we are seeing early signs of at least rhetorical support for Iran's ability to impose a ceasefire on the enemy by various Iraqi Shia communities and groups. I think looking ahead, one point is how much influence or pressure can Gulf states put on the future nuclear talks, whether, for example, Qatar, having come under direct attack, of course, it was the US airbase that was targeted, but it was over Qatari airspace. Will Gulf states try to influence the scope of the future talks? There were, in previous years, and up until recently as well, discussion about expanding negotiations to include Iran's missile ballistic program, as well as its support or foreign policy, regional posturing with respect to other proxies, for example. On another level, how will the regional states approach, encounter, and experience American diplomacy and American diplomatic overtures because of the trust deficit that has arguably now emerged and the widening gap between the trust positions of various actors? Whilst on the one side, the Oman facilitated talks were ongoing, these were cut short by the military option, as well as some reports or suspicions, rather, that the US and Israel were sort of choreographing the operation, sort of a decoy method against Iran. So does this then open up more of a space for European actors, for multilateral organizations to be more trusted, incredible intermediaries over the Middle East, particularly over the Iran issue? So that's one side of this. On the other side, I suppose one could also argue that through Operation Midnight Hammer, the United States demonstrated that it is willing and ready to act, and has not completed by any means its pivot away from the Middle East. So this Trump policy of peace through strength, what will that mean in terms of the demonstration of American military superiority in the Middle East and the Gulf reliance on US security guarantees? So I may have raised more questions there than answered, but I think that's quite typical in the current moment where we are. But thank you.
Thank you, Burcu. It's excellent. Thank you for spotlighting the serious regional concerns regarding potential spillovers. Thank you also for mentioning the two myths of military power, that Iran's nuclear program is untouchable and that the US bases are not vulnerable. So thank you for unpacking that, and thank you also for going a little bit into the what lies ahead and what role and how much pressure can Gulf states put in on future talks. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, but I just want to bring Héloïse in with a perspective from E3 and the EU. What was the reaction coming from the E3 and EU, and maybe to go even deeper a little bit, what are the differences, or what were the differences between their positions? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihai, for having me on this panel, and thank you for the other panelists. I fully agree with what was said, especially the need for a victory narrative for the three actors. I think it was a particular good point that we already see nowadays with every actor that wants to say that its action was efficient, especially through the manipulation of intelligence. And maybe that's something that we can go back during the questions. So over this period of 12 days, so since from Friday 13 to, let's say, yesterday, we saw an evolution of the E3 positions, and also the one from the EU. And I will focus also on France because, of course, it's where I live, and so the one I studied the most, and also the one that mostly evolved over the course of 12 days. So just after the strikes, the initial Israeli strikes on Iran, I think we were particularly surprised to see among the E3 and the EU declarations that basically everyone was not blaming Israel, not condemning the Israeli strikes, and even making a parallel between the fact that Iran must not gain a nuclear weapon, must not obtain a nuclear weapon, and the Israeli strikes that were happening over Iran. And so it was almost like an authorization given by the E3 countries through for example, the official statements from France and from Germany and from the UK on Friday 13, that every statement reminded really the fact that Iran must not gain a nuclear weapon, and so kind of underlined that the Israeli strikes were necessary to stop the nuclear Iranian program, because the diplomatic negotiation had partly failed before the strikes. It was a bit surprising to see that, and I think it was. I mean, one of the theories is that in fact the intelligence, the Israeli intelligence that was supposedly shown to Donald Trump to justify their action against a nuclear program, meaning the fact that the Iranian nuclear program made a breakthrough that really needed to be stopped. It seems that it was also presented to some European governments. It's not sure, but it's maybe I think it's something that happened, and so that's why maybe at the beginning there was such a strong support for the Israeli actions. It's even Chancellor Merz in Germany who basically said that everyone was quite happy that, or at least relieved that Israel was doing the job because diplomacy didn't work. This position slightly evolved over the days, and you all know that on last Friday, so Friday 20th, there was a last attempt for diplomacy with E3 meeting plus Iran in Geneva. That was presented as the EU effort to try to solve this crisis diplomatically, but it was immediately heavily criticized by the US. Donald Trump said it was completely useless, and that if Iran wanted to talk to someone, they would talk to the US directly and not to the European countries. So it shows again how the Europeans, and especially the E3, were sidelining really and put apart the whole negotiation process since Donald Trump came back to to the White House. And I really think the evolution of the French position since January 25, we saw kind of an alignment on the US position with very strong words, for example, from President Macron in January 25, who said that nowadays the biggest threat to French forces in the Middle East was Iran and not, for example, ISIS or Sunni terrorism anymore. The French position slightly shifted after the US bombings. And for example, the statement after the US bombing said that France witnessed the US bombing with concern. So it was really an evolution of the language, even though, of course, there was no condemnation of the strikes. And also the French position really stated that France did not participate in the planning of the operation or the operation itself. And it was, I think, a necessary precaution because France has specific interests in the Middle East and in the Gulf region. We have defense agreements with the UAE, with Qatar, and there is a huge French military base in the UAE. So, of course, the risk of direct Iranian retaliation, like the one we saw on Monday evening on Qatar, was high on the UAE, and so possibly on French forces in the UAE. So that's why maybe there was this like say precautions in the French language. Also, President Macron said he was against this idea of a regime change that was promoted by Donald Trump, and say that, for example, there was no possible regime change through bombing of the country. So this maybe it was the position that was the most critique, let's say, of Trump that we could expect from President Macron. But at the same time, of course, Europe is now busy with another issue, meaning the NATO summit, and the communique of the NATO summit has just been published. So also, I think it was maybe a bit complicated for the EU countries to follow two heavy files at the same time. So that's why maybe also there was not such a strong reaction to the events in the Middle East. Nowadays, I think for the future, the idea of the E3 is really to reignite the diplomatic process. But as it has been said, the events were really a breach of trust. I mean, there was not much trust left, but it's even worse now between the E3, Iran, and of course the US. So I hope this process of relaunching diplomatic negotiations will work, because of course the Iranian nuclear issue, let's say, is not solved at all. Because the JCPOA is expiring in mid-October. So all the issues we had before the Israeli strikes, meaning the snapback that can still be implemented by European countries, the issue regarding the transparency and verification process around the Iranian nuclear program are still there. And it's even worse regarding transparency, because the IAEA doesn't have access anymore to the sites, and Iran might be, let's say, changing its relation with the IAEA. So yeah, first, I really hope that diplomacy will work, but I don't have high hopes. And I would say my last point for the regarding the E3 EU reaction is that we at the European level really need an independent assessment of the situation. I think really the European countries were heavily dependent on US and Israeli intelligence regarding what's really happening in Iran, and also IAEA report. So I hope the situation will maybe push for, let's say, yeah, more independent capabilities regarding strategic assessment of what's happening in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Héloïse. You gave us a lot to unpack, but thank you for going more in depth into the E3 and the EU position, but also a little bit into the future and the role that the E3 could play to reestablish trust. Also, some of your remarks, it got me thinking, because of course the EU and E3 have not, of course, criticized the Israeli strikes in the beginning. How does this play out with the global South? I'm just wondering, does this mean that the EU will lose even more credibility?
Yeah, I think it really fuels the accusation of double standards that we see since the beginning of the war in Gaza. The fact that basically Israel is doing the same to Gaza that Russia is doing to Ukraine, and there is no condemnation of Israel. So yeah, I think it will give Europe even less credibility, and also that's why I think maybe Russia has a role to play in the future negotiations. We saw the Iranian MFA in Russia a couple of days, and I think that maybe unfortunately they might appear like the only country that could maybe bring back Iran to the table, yeah, and not the EU.
Thank you, Héloïse. I'm looking in the Q&A, and Adnan has been very kind to already answer one of the questions there. Thank you, Adnan, is much appreciated. Just to encourage everyone to pose your questions. Now we have about 24 minutes left. But in the meantime, let me just go back a little bit to that diplomatic path to a potential JCPOA 2.0, if we can call it like that. And I would like to turn back to you, Nimrod, and then to Adnan. How does this look from the Israeli perspective, Nimrod?
Yeah, I think from the Israeli perspective, the focus is now shifting elsewhere, okay? Because the role of Israel within this whole reality is now being sidelined. It's now back going to the American-Iranian playground, and Israel is now looking again at Gaza. Only today, 7 Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza. Palestinians were damaged as well. So the fact that the Gaza war time after time has been sidelined when major other issues happen in the region, we saw it with the transitions in Syria and Lebanon during the time of which people kind of a bit forgot about Gaza in the international community. And we saw it happen now. Look at the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU and all the hype about the review of the association agreement with Israel. It's kind of pushed back because now the agenda is full with something else. So from an Israeli perspective, what happens now on Iran is American. Let Trump do his thing. Israel kind of keeps the ability to operate in Iran open as necessary. The military capacity has been shown, and Israel is keeping this card. I'm not sure how easy it will do that again, but it supposedly has the capacity to do it once more. And the focus moves on to other aspects. One aspect is Gaza, okay? And there are reports, contradicting reports over the last couple of days on progress being made in a discussion about a potential ceasefire in Gaza. There are talks in Cairo, the Qataris are involved, the Americans, so there is hope that one diplomatic achievement or a landmark, let's say, in Iran will spill over to another one, that maybe President Trump would be doing the same kind of dictate he did for a ceasefire between Israel and Iran to what is happening in Gaza. So that's one question mark people are looking to. And the second is the broader transitions within Israel's immediate neighborhood. And for that, Israelis were looking at how the different Arab countries, not necessarily the Gulf, but along our borders, were dealing with what happened between Israel and Iran. And the takeaway there is that the new reality in which Israel has enhanced diplomatic ties or coordination level with its immediate Arab neighbors, that is resilient both to a war in Gaza and to a confrontation with Iran. Because what we saw during those 12 days is first, messages very clear from the new leadership in Lebanon to Hezbollah not to get involved in the fighting. That's new from an Israeli perspective. We saw the role the new Syrian regime were playing, the messages that were conveyed, the coordination with the Americans. Yesterday it was leaked, there was like daily coordination and engagement directly with Israeli officials on managing the situation. We saw Jordan, that once again, like the previous Iran attacks, played a role de facto in protecting the Israeli security, also its own airspace, but practically taking part in this defense of Israel. And we saw Egypt and Jordan being the country through which Israelis that were trapped in other countries that could not travel home because the airport was closed were flying to Amman, were flying to Aqaba, were flying to Farim. These are things that never happen on a regular basis and now happened in large scope. So for Israelis, the fruits of peace or the regional transitions were very much evident, much like today, the first foreign carrier to resume flights to Tel Aviv or to announce that is Fly Dubai. Okay, it's the Emiratis, not European carriers, not American carriers. So all of that creates an understanding in Israel that there is a different regional construct here that plays into Israel's interest. And if that is coupled with an alignment with the American administration, maybe that creates favorable conditions to move forward toward the much anticipated ceasefire in Gaza that until now Netanyahu did not want to play. But maybe now, after the success, as he perceived it in Iran, may be beneficial for him also politically, which, as we saw during the last 2 years, his political motivations are eventually the ones that are ruling what he will or will not do in terms of national security and foreign policy.
Thank you, Nimrod. I'm looking at you now, Adnan. If you want to come in on that promising diplomatic path, if there is any way sort of to, to reestablish the trust. But maybe I see in the Q&A also a couple of other questions, so maybe I can add those, and then you can touch upon what you feel is most suitable. And I have a question from our colleague at EPC, Paul Taylor, who's asking, how credible do Adnan and Burcu think the Iranian leadership victory narrative will be with ordinary Iranians? How likely is that there will be a serious movement for political change after the war? So I'll give you the floor, Adnan, and then we'll go to you, Burcu, for any comments.
Thank you, Mihai, and thank you for the questions. Look, I think what will be important for what used to be a very promising diplomatic path forward, it's not clear that it still is, but there are already rumors that Steve Witkoff, the envoy of Donald Trump for the Middle East, is reaching out, trying to get another meeting. What, in my view, will be important for that to work are a few things. First, for Iran, it has to be clear that there really is a difference between the restrainer movement around MAGA in the US and the neocons. If the Iranians come to the conclusion this is one and the same thing, there will be no appetite to speak to this government anymore. The impression after the events of the past 2 weeks is exactly that it is the same, because we have ended up seeing neocon-style bombardments, Operation Midnight Hammer. So this is going to be the first thing. Will the Americans be able to convey to the Iranians that MAGA is different and it's not the same thing as neocons? Secondly, how much will Iran be able to differentiate between the US and Israel? My assessment right now is that at the beginning of the war and in the course of these 12 days, this differentiation was made intentionally quite clear, that Israel is not the US. And vice versa. But of course, that is difficult to hold up, given US involvement, given US very direct involvement. So this will also be very important. All the assets that the Israelis had been able to drive into Iran, are they basically switched off now, or will they operate? And if they operate, will Iran hold Israel accountable for it? That's going to be a very, very difficult thing to look at. Plus, of course, Burcu alluded to it and will probably elaborate more on it, these different allied groups of Iran in the region who have their own calculus at the end of the day. What will they do at a certain point? And that may also derail things. And lastly, I would say we are also hearing today that Syria and Lebanon are future candidates of the Abraham Accords. We have heard a few weeks back and a few months back that even Azerbaijan might be a country for the Abraham Accords. With the rumors that Azerbaijan, in one way or another, helped the Israeli air campaign through its airspace. But again, this is something that I just read. I couldn't possibly say that is the case. So these questions will be in the air. And given all of these very sensitive questions, it's going to be difficult enough to set up another meeting to continue the conversation. And of course, Iran's position vis-a-vis the US will be such that it won't make things easier. But I think we may at least see an effort. Lastly, whether or not they will continue to happen in Oman or go somewhere else is also probably open now after how Qatar played a role. But let's see, these are very, very open questions.
Thank you, Adnan. In the meantime, I see another question in the Q&A related to Turkey, and basically I'm just summarizing now how can we define Turkey's role in the conflict and in a geopolitical shift in the region, more broader question here. But we have also the previous one to you, Burcu. If you want to come in, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. It's not really my place to talk Iran domestic whilst Adnan is on the panel, but just one comment, I suppose, on the likelihood of political reform or change in Iran following this war. I think we shouldn't be too dismissive of the possibility that there will be a series of demands by reformists, by civil society, by those that have been influenced and impacted by the events of the past 12, 13 days of conflict. A type of questioning around whether Iran should pursue a nuclear program, and certainly whether it should pursue the weaponization path. A lot of the analysis that we've been seeing in the past a few days or since the war really kicked off was that this would push Iran, compel Iran, leave Iranian leaders with no other alternative but to dash to the bomb. And again, I think this is a sort of a premature overgeneralization and assumption. I think there will be pushback and some debate within the country about the merits of this, if particularly given the experience of the conflict and what this would do to invite future American or Israeli strikes inside Iran on the Iranian homeland. So I think that is going to be up for debate, and political change in Iran, when it has happened, has been over through debate and through incremental steps, through a pro-reform process rather than an upheaval. And I think what we're seeing now is that the regime, the idea of regime collapse has not happened, that Iran continues to function, its state institutions continue to function. But does that then mean that the path to reform at all, and some public pondering or questioning about what can be done to shift the dial, is that I don't think it should be a foregone conclusion that debate won't happen internally. I think in terms of the role and the evolution of Iran-linked armed groups in the Middle East, particularly given time, if I comment on Iraq. Iraq is, there's a parliamentary elections due to take place later this year in November. And one of the key debates at the national level, but also at the subnational level, has been over the high level of influence, of penetration that Iran has enjoyed over Iraq, which has evolved over the decades since the post-2003 US invasion. So the role of Iran over the Iraqi political and military and economic space is one that's hotly debated inside Iraq, along a spectrum. But one view is that it has led to problems, that Iran has too much influence, that an Iraqi-first nationalism is having a resurgence. And it's particularly amongst the youth, who have been increasingly frustrated with external interference or influence, let's say, inside Iraq. On the other hand, now I think what it's going to be very interesting to monitor and analyze is how Iran's victory narrative will, or whether it will sway public sentiment in Iraq among Shia communities, and whether it favors the status quo in terms of the close proximity of relations with Iran over Iraq. So the elections upcoming ahead, I think, are going to be important, a barometer of where Iraq positions itself in its relationship with Tehran. And of course, Baghdad plays an important balancing act between its relations with the US, Iran, and Turkey. So if we come to Turkey finally, over the course of this war, Turkey was not able to successfully place itself in the role of intermediary, not to the extent where it did achieve some recognition in Russia on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for example. Turkish President Erdogan has been a very vocal critic of Israeli actions in Gaza. And therefore, Israel would not have seen Erdogan as a trusted intermediary to talk about how to de-escalate. So it's going to be complicated, and I think where Turkey-Iran relations will potentially clash and where the fault line lies is really in Syria, in the extent to which this narrative, again, of Turkey on the rise and Iran having lost Syria, how that will impact the evolution of bilateral relations and at the regional level as well. So given recent instability in Syria and the terrorist attack against the Christian community, for example, there's the notion of sectarian violence reemerging in Syria, the potential that the path to stability and economic reopening is somehow under renewed threat. All eyes will be on Syria once again. So Gaza had been pushed aside or had become a secondary theater. Syria had also been sort of sidelined, as we all watched, and justifiably so, Iran and Israel. But now I think Syria will come back onto our radars, and there it's going to be interesting to watch what influence Iran will seek to assert over the Syrian theater. Very, very little up to this point in the post-Assad moment, but where that will go will be interesting to track. But I think much of this depends on how Iran repositions itself in the region and how it redefines its security doctrine that was based on three main pillars: the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and its proxy network. So how this evolves over time and the reinstating of the command and control structures at the top of the Iranian armed force and military intelligence apparatus will determine how Iran repositions or pivots or not with respect to its proxies. But many of these groups, particularly the Houthis in Yemen, for example, have defied the conventional patron-client relationship and have acted with greater autonomy and asserted agency. And so already we had seen that the assumption that Iran was pulling the strings as the puppet master, that was changing, particularly over the course of the war since the 7th of October attacks. Thank you.
Thank you, Burcu. Very eloquent, and also thank you for widening a bit the lens into the regional aspects. I'm looking now also in the Q&A, and I think there's also a question here for you, Héloïse, on the why does Europe find it so difficult to move beyond its somewhat passive role in this conflict, and what the EU could do. I see, Adnan, you're also typing something there. I don't know if that's you also want to. No, it's just okay. It's just the system.
No. It's funny that you see that. I was thinking about typing, but I decided not to. I didn't know you would see it.
I think Zoom is reading your mind. But if you want to add something on that later, please do come in. But now let's go to you, Héloïse, if you want to sort of say something on this.
Yeah, on the EU. So I'm not a specialist on the EU foreign policy, but from my kind of first, it's highly divided. Meaning, for example, Germany has a special relationship to Israel, so it can't criticize, I think, Israel as much as it could do or would like to do. France also can be sometimes very scared by what we call the importation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in France, as we host both a huge Muslim community and a huge Jewish community. And also the EU has never managed, I think, to position itself as a credible foreign policy actor. First, because of a lack of unity within the union, but also just a lack of representativity, and also the fact that, I mean, again, the biggest threat for Europe and for European Union right now is not Iran. It's not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not the war in Gaza. It's of course Ukraine and Russia. So a lot of resources are dedicated to that. And Kaja Kallas, so the High Representative for the EU on foreign policy, is really Russia focused. She doesn't really. She doesn't have a background on other dossiers like the Middle East, and usually all the actions that are, let's say, undertaken by the EU outside of the EU are mostly seen through the lens of global aid, for example, or development capabilities and stuff like training of military forces. For example, in Mali or in the African countries, it's also there in Lebanon and in Iraq for training operations of the militaries. But it's more on like an operational level rather than on a political level. So I'm not surprised that unfortunately, we don't see any clear resolution from the EU to act against Israel, or to at least to condemn the Israeli strikes. And just there was another question within the question that is not related to the EU, but more on my area of expertise on the nuclear proliferation, and the fact that we did push other states toward proliferation. So we talked a bit already, but I think really the events really show the failure of the nuclear latency strategy that was undertaken by Iran, but it's also undertaken by other countries like South Korea, Japan, and it comes with a global, let's say, disrespect of the non-proliferation regime. Even coming from countries who used to be, let's say, the guarantors of this non-proliferation regime. I'm thinking mostly about the United States, because, for example, you're not supposed to bomb like nuclear facilities that are protected under the NPT and also under IAEA agreements. And when you see, for example, that Donald Trump said multiple times that, for example, he would prefer South Korea to have a nuclear weapon, like an independent nuclear weapon, rather than spending money to maintain like dozens of thousands of US soldiers in South Korea. I think it's really worrying for the future of the non-proliferation regime. And again, if we don't react to like South Korea going further towards a nuclear weapon with polls that say that like 70% of the population sees with a favorable eye to have nuclear weapons, then how can we criticize, Iran for wanting to do the same? So I think we really have to be careful, and maybe that's where the EU could do something, is really to stand and to uphold this non-proliferation norm through research, through disarmament communities, and initiatives like that. But I think these events really will have an impact on the non-proliferation regime, especially if Iran withdraws for the NPT.
Thank you, Héloïse. Thank you also for focusing on this non-proliferation aspect. I'm looking at the time and I see that we have about 2 minutes left. So I propose that we do the following, and I'm just going to ask a question to all of you, which is to sort of highlight one lesson learned from the past 2 weeks that you think it's sort of most, or that you think is very important for the future. And maybe we'll go in the initial order, if I may. I also want to add that there is another question in the Q&A. Do you think that Hezbollah may get involved in a conflict if tensions between Israel and Iran escalate? Again, I recall that you, Nimrod, you also touched upon Hezbollah earlier in an earlier intervention, but if you want to add a couple of words on this, please feel free. So one lesson learned, but very quickly, maybe 1 minute max. For each, so we also don't go too much over time. And I'm looking at you, Nimrod. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Lesson learned, I think that for Israel's national security, whatever happens in Iran, we need to look at Gaza. We need to look at the Palestinian issue. That's the core issue. Israel needs to resolve that. It needs to end the war. It needs to move to two-state solution. Once that happens, regional integration, normalization will enhance, and that will also serve Israeli needs vis-a-vis Iran. And there's no military solution. You can have military gains. Eventually, it boils down to diplomacy. And one word on Hezbollah, I don't see Hezbollah intervening very quickly. If it didn't do so under such circumstances in which Iran was so much under damage and threat and attacks, I don't see it doing that under any circumstances coming soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nimrod. Adnan, please go ahead.
I would focus my lessons learned on Europe and that you cannot be an actor for de-escalation if your position, your public position, is not calling for restraint from all parties. So this is not about not aligning with Israel. I'm not saying that. There is a reason for why Europe sees Israel as an ally, and it's not just to protect it. It's really about many more things. But that doesn't mean that in calls for de-escalation and for restraint, you cannot do better by addressing both sides and therefore being a credible mediator. In fact, this has to be this strength has to be regained in Europe. Iran has made multiple lessons to be learned, and in particular, the focus of its own internal security apparatus shouldn't be so much on how people dress, but rather on potential risks inflicted upon external agents entering the country. There are obviously more, but in the interest of time, I'll pass on to Burcu.
Thank you, Adnan. Please, Burcu, go ahead.
Lessons learned, I'll be very brief. I think it's hopefully that external actors have finally learned that regime change is a dirty word and that we mustn't presume to be able to speak on behalf of or in the name of Iranian or other peoples elsewhere who will decide their own futures and exercise their right to self-determination on their own terms in their own way.
Thank you. Héloïse, please go ahead.
Yeah, same what I say, meaning like a strategy of nuclear latency doesn't work if you don't have the conventional forces to really endure such military strikes. So it can be learned either as a country will never develop nuclear weapons because they are too scared of being targeted by another country, so they prefer to join nuclear alliance, for example, or they will do everything that is possible to have a fully clandestine nuclear program, hoping then when they really cross publicly the threshold, they will find like a nuclear protector, like the US, for example, for South Korea, that will shield them from public criticism and international sanctions. So yeah, we really must uphold the non-proliferation norm in the whole world.
Thank you, Héloïse. We're a couple of minutes over time. Apologies for that, but I think we had a very fruitful discussion. Thank you for outlining multiple lessons learned and just one each. And I'm looking forward to continue this conversation. And EPC will continue its activities on the Middle East in the coming weeks. So thank you very much for joining us, and I wish you a nice evening.
Thank you.